The HOA waited for me in the dark, but they never saw my Marine friend watching. I thought I was driving home after an ordinary day fixing irrigation equipment. Instead, I found floodlights, barricades, and people in fake safety jackets telling me I couldn't enter my own ranch. They acted like they owned the land my family had protected for generations. What they didn't know is that my former Marine friend had been hiding nearby for hours, quietly recording every lie, every fake boundary marker, and every step of a plan that was about to collapse under its own weight. Stay with me, because what started as one blocked driveway turned into a courtroom battle that nobody at that checkpoint saw coming. And if you enjoy true-to-life HOA justice stories where patience, evidence, and the law matter more than shouting, take a second to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The dashboard clock clicked over to 11:47 p.m. as my old Ford rumbled off the county highway and onto the gravel road leading toward Lynch Lake. I'd spent nearly 14 hours helping a neighboring ranch replace a failed irrigation pump before tomorrow's water release, and every muscle in my back reminded me of it. My boots were dusty, my hands still smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid, and all I wanted was to park the truck, feed my old Labrador, Duke, and sit on my porch long enough to hear the lake settle into the night. Out here in western Montana, silence was worth more than expensive lakefront houses or polished HOA newsletters. Silence meant fences were standing, cattle were where they belonged, and nobody had decided your property was suddenly everyone else's business. My ranch sat on 230 acres wrapping around the western shoreline of Lynch Lake. My grandfather had bought the place before paved roads reached this valley. Every fence post, every cedar gate, every foot of shoreline had been earned one season at a time. The deed rested in a fireproof safe inside my office, but I never needed to read it to know exactly where my land began and ended. As my headlights swept around the final bend, something bright flashed across the windshield. Floodlights. I frowned. Nobody should have been using floodlights on my driveway. Then another beam hit the truck. My foot eased off the accelerator. 3 black SUVs sat sideways across my entrance, their headlights off but portable work lights blazing across the gravel. Orange barricades stretched from one ditch to the other. Reflective cones lined both sides of the entrance, like somebody had closed a state highway instead of a private ranch road. What in the world? Duke lifted his head from the passenger seat and gave a low growl. I felt it too. This wasn't right. I rolled closer until my front bumper stopped a few feet from the first barricade. Half a dozen people stepped into the light, wearing matching navy jackets with bright yellow lettering across the back. Community safety. There wasn't a county badge among them. One man, broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair, walked toward my truck carrying a clipboard like it granted him authority. He raised a hand. "Sir, that's far enough." I lowered my window halfway. "Evening." He didn't return the greeting. "This property is currently under an emergency environmental inspection. Access has been temporarily suspended." I stared at him. "I'm sorry." "What?" "You'll need to turn your vehicle around." I looked past him toward my own gate. "My house is a quarter-mile up that driveway." "I understand." "No," I said evenly. "I don't think you do." He glanced back toward the others before squaring his shoulders. This inspection was authorized to protect community interests surrounding the shoreline. Community interests. I'd heard those words before. Lake Ridge Estates. The HOA on the opposite side of the lake loved phrases like that. Community standards, community access, community safety. Funny thing was, none of those communities owned a single inch of my ranch. "I'm Ethan Walker," I said calmly. "You're blocking my private driveway." The man nodded as though he'd already rehearsed this conversation. Mr. Walker, cooperation tonight will make this process much easier. I couldn't help smiling. Process? He tapped his clipboard. We've identified potential environmental concerns affecting neighboring properties. So naturally, I replied, you parked 3 SUVs across my entrance. Behind him, another volunteer quietly raised a phone and began recording. Then another. Interesting. They weren't just waiting for me. They expected me. I shut off my engine but left the headlights on. Who's in charge? The man answered immediately. I am. Brent Collins. I've never heard of you. I'm the Community Safety Coordinator. For who? The Homeowners Association. I leaned back against the seat. That's funny. Brent frowned. Why? Because I don't belong to your Homeowners Association. A few of the volunteers exchanged uncertain looks. Brent recovered quickly. This situation extends beyond membership. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. For the first time, irritation crept into his expression. Mr. Walker, refusing to cooperate may complicate matters. I folded my hands on the steering wheel. And what law gives you the authority to stop me from driving into my own ranch? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Instead, he glanced toward the others. Nobody answered. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then a calm voice drifted out of the darkness beyond the fence line. Don't waste your breath, Ethan. Every head turned. The volunteers suddenly looked nervous. A tall figure stepped out from behind the cottonwoods bordering my pasture. Hands relaxed, ball cap pulled low, phone still recording. Even before the floodlight caught his face, I recognized the walk. Caleb Brooks, former Force Recon Marine, one of the few men I trusted without question. He stopped beside my truck without looking at Brent. You made it home. I nodded slowly. What are you doing out here? Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the people blocking my driveway. I've been waiting. For me? For them. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. Then he looked straight at me. Whatever happens next, he said quietly. Don't argue. I frowned. Why? His expression never changed. Because I've been recording these people for almost 3 hours. Every volunteer standing behind Brent suddenly went very, very still. Brent forced a laugh that sounded far less confident than it had a moment earlier. I don't know what you think you recorded, he said, but none of this changes the fact that we're conducting an authorized inspection. Caleb didn't answer. He simply folded his arms. The silence unsettled them more than any argument ever could. I looked from Brent to Caleb. What happened? Caleb met my eyes. You deserve the whole story. Nearly 12 hours earlier, at 11:15 that morning, while I was replacing irrigation valves 20 miles away, the board of Cedar Ridge Shores HOA gathered inside their clubhouse overlooking the eastern side of Lynch Lake. HOA President Diane Mercer stood beside a large county map taped to the wall. A thick red marker circled my ranch. Mr. Walker's shoreline, she announced, tapping the paper, is becoming a community problem. About a dozen board members shifted in their folding chairs. Most looked uncertain. One looked excited. That was Brent Collins. Diane continued. Our homeowners purchased lake access. What they didn't purchase was a 20-minute detour every time they want to fish. Gary Nolan, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat. Technically, the public launch is still available. Diane barely looked at him. It is inconvenient. Linda Foster quietly spoke from the back. Inconvenience isn't a legal argument. Several heads turned. Diane smiled politely. No, Linda. She tapped my shoreline again. But public safety is. Brent leaned forward. Exactly. Diane picked up a folder and began handing copies around the room. These are temporary environmental inspection notices. Gary flipped through the pages. I don't recognize this county form. It isn't a county form, Diane answered. It's our community version. Linda frowned. Our community version? We're documenting shoreline hazards. Linda looked around the room. On land the HOA doesn't own? Nobody answered. Diane's smile disappeared. We're protecting property values. She walked to the window overlooking the lake. Mr. Walker refuses to cooperate with neighborhood concerns. Every request has been ignored. They weren't requests, Linda replied quietly. They were demands. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Diane turned back. This discussion isn't about personalities. It's about access. Brent stood. My volunteer team can handle everything. Diane nodded. Good. She rolled out a second map. This one showed my ranch entrance. We'll establish a temporary inspection checkpoint. Gary blinked. On his driveway? At the entrance. Linda stared in disbelief. You can't block someone's private road. We're not blocking it. Diane smiled again. We're controlling access during an active inspection. Gary rubbed his forehead. Who authorized this inspection? I did. Linda slowly stood. That's not how property law works. Diane ignored her. She began assigning responsibilities. Brent, you'll coordinate volunteers. Gary, you'll prepare inspection packets. Jason handles photography. Emily records every interaction. Brent grinned. If Walker gets angry? Diane answered immediately. Stay calm. She walked to the center of the room. Every phone records. If he raises his voice, she paused. Keep filming. If he touches anything, another pause. Keep filming. If he refuses to cooperate. Brent finished her sentence. We document everything. Exactly. Linda crossed her arms. And what exactly are we documenting? Diane looked directly at her. Behavior. Linda shook her head. You're trying to manufacture a confrontation. No. Diane's voice hardened. We're creating accountability. She slid one final sheet across the table. Everyone participating signs here. Brent signed immediately. Gary hesitated before adding his name. Several others followed. Linda didn't move. She picked up the paper instead. Near the bottom, written in Diane's own handwriting, one sentence caught her attention. Create documentation first. Legal justification can follow after community review. Linda looked up. Diane. The HOA president reached over and calmly took the paper back. That's an internal planning note. It shouldn't be. It's not leaving this room. Linda looked around at the others. Do any of you understand what you're signing? Nobody answered. Brent finally broke the silence. We're protecting the neighborhood. Linda quietly gathered her purse. No. She walked toward the exit. You're about to make the biggest mistake this association has ever made. The door closed behind her. Nobody followed. An hour later, 3 black SUVs rolled away from the clubhouse toward my ranch. None of them noticed another pickup sitting quietly beneath a line of cottonwoods across the lake. Caleb Brooks had arrived to return a surveying transit I'd loaned him the week before. He watched the convoy pass. Then he looked toward my empty ranch. Something about the timing didn't feel right. So instead of driving away, he followed. Caleb kept 300 yards behind the convoy as the SUVs wound around the western edge of Lynch Lake. They never once questioned whether someone might be watching them. Men who believed they were in control rarely did. When the vehicles disappeared through the trees near my ranch entrance, Caleb turned onto an old logging trail that overlooked the pasture. He parked beneath a stand of ponderosa pines where his truck couldn't be seen from the road. He grabbed the surveying transit he'd intended to return to me, then smiled to himself. Guess it'll wait another day. As he stepped onto the trail, the first thing he noticed wasn't the people. It was the ground. Fresh tire tracks crossed my cattle guard. Heavy SUVs had driven onto the shoulder instead of staying on the gravel, crushing grass that had been standing that morning. A line of bright orange survey paint appeared every 30 yards, leading toward the lake. Caleb crouched beside one of the marks. Brand new. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The camera swept across fresh boot prints, tire impressions, and a stack of white fiberglass boundary stakes leaning against the fence. None of them belonged there. He followed the tracks until voices drifted through the trees. Move that marker another 10 feet. No, Diane wants it closer to the shoreline. Caleb eased behind a cedar trunk. About 50 yards away, Brent Collins directed 4 volunteers across my pasture like a construction foreman. One man hammered stakes into the ground. Another stretched bright survey ribbon between them. A woman photographed every angle before writing notes on a clipboard. Brent pointed toward my dock. Make sure the pictures don't include his property corner marker. The photographer frowned. Why? Because then it'll be obvious we're outside the HOA. Nobody questioned him. Caleb zoomed in. Every face, every voice, every action. One volunteer carried a laminated sign reading, Temporary Environmental Review Area. Another asked, should we actually test the soil? Brent laughed. We're not testing anything. So why the equipment? It looks official. Several volunteers chuckled. Caleb didn't. His camera remained perfectly steady. A younger man walked over carrying a small metal post. Where do you want this? Brent unfolded a map. Right here. The volunteer studied it. But according to his fence, Brent interrupted. Forget the fence. He tapped the paper. Tomorrow morning, this becomes the proposed shoreline corridor. Caleb's expression hardened. A proposed corridor, not an existing easement, not county property. A proposal they intended to make look established before anyone asked questions. The volunteer hesitated. Does Walker know about any of this? Brent smirked. He'll find out tonight. More laughter. Another woman lowered her voice. What if he calls the sheriff? Brent didn't even look concerned. Diane already thought of that. How? We're documenting everything first. He held up his clipboard. If we're already conducting an inspection when he arrives, he'll look like the one interrupting official business. The group nodded. Caleb quietly recorded every word. One older volunteer looked uncomfortable. I still don't understand how we can inspect property we don't own. Brent sighed. You worry too much. It's just temporary. Once the county sees our documentation, they'll realize public shoreline access has been neglected. And if they don't? Brent smiled. Then we apply pressure. The words lingered in the quiet. Caleb slowly shifted to another position as the volunteers spread farther across the pasture. Near my equipment shed, 2 men unfolded portable barricades still wrapped in plastic. One peeled away the shipping label. Another tested a battery-powered floodlight. Caleb zoomed in again. They weren't preparing for daylight. They were building something for after dark. His phone vibrated. No signal. He tried calling me anyway. Nothing. The screen displayed one stubborn message. Call failed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Figures. A pickup pulled into the pasture entrance. Diane Mercer climbed out wearing pressed jeans and a navy jacket with the words, Community Safety embroidered across the chest. She inspected the work like a project manager walking a job site. Good. She nodded toward the barricades. Those stay hidden until tonight. Brent pointed toward my driveway. We'll have him stopped before he reaches the gate. And the cameras? Every angle covered. Diane smiled. I want this documented from beginning to end. What if he refuses to leave? He won't have a choice. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about shoreline access. It wasn't even about the HOA anymore. This was a carefully planned confrontation. Every conversation, every prop, every staged photograph, every false marker. Everything had one purpose: to manufacture a legal dispute before I even knew one existed. He backed deeper into the trees without making a sound. If he exposed himself now, they'd pack everything up. If he waited, they might reveal the entire plan. Caleb looked toward my empty house sitting beyond the pasture, then back toward the volunteers unloading even more barricades from the SUVs. Quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "You people aren't just trespassing anymore. You think you're about to rewrite a property line." Caleb stayed hidden until the last SUV pulled away from the pasture. For nearly 2 hours, the ranch sat quiet again. The fake survey stakes remained. The ribbon fluttered between fence posts. Portable barricades had disappeared, but Caleb knew they hadn't been taken far. Diane had been clear. They were waiting for night. He walked carefully through the entrance, filming every marker from multiple angles before stopping beside one of the fiberglass stakes. He never touched it. Instead, he zoomed in on the fresh hammer marks in the dirt. "Exactly where the county survey pin should be visible," he murmured. The actual iron monument sat barely 6 feet away, undisturbed, proving anyone standing there could clearly see the true property corner. Whoever placed the new stake hadn't made a mistake. They had intentionally ignored the legal boundary. Caleb continued recording until the fading daylight forced him back toward the trees. Just after 9 o'clock, engines echoed through the valley again. They're back. 3 SUVs rolled into my entrance exactly as planned. This time they unloaded everything: reflective barricades, traffic cones, portable floodlights, a folding table, a stack of clipboards, even a large aluminum sign reading "Community Environmental Inspection. Authorized personnel only." Brent stepped out first, moved the barricade closer. Volunteers dragged it directly across my driveway. One woman stretched yellow caution tape from a fence post to the opposite ditch. Another carefully positioned floodlights, so anyone arriving would be forced into the brightest part of the entrance. Diane inspected every detail. No gaps. "If he tries driving around us?" Brent pointed toward the shallow drainage ditch beside the road. "We'll block that too." 2 volunteers immediately rolled heavy landscaping boulders into place. Caleb's camera followed every movement. One younger volunteer shifted nervously. "Isn't this excessive?" Diane looked at him without blinking. "Tonight is about documentation," Brent added. "The more official this looks, the better." The young man nodded uncertainly. A woman carrying a tablet approached Diane. "We've got the cameras ready." "Good. I want continuous recording." She looked around the group. "The moment Ethan arrives, nobody argues. Nobody raises their voice. We remain calm." She paused. "If he becomes confrontational," Brent smiled, "the cameras see everything." Caleb whispered under his breath, "That's the plan." Another volunteer raised a hand. "What exactly do we tell him?" Brent answered immediately. "Tell him the property is temporarily closed pending environmental review. And if he asks who authorized it?" Diane didn't hesitate. "The HOA board. But he isn't part of the HOA. He doesn't need to be." Caleb slowly shook his head. That sentence alone would matter later. A few minutes passed before another volunteer climbed out of the last SUV carrying a small locking chain. Brent pointed toward my cedar entrance gate. "Wrap it across." The man hesitated. "We're actually locking it?" "No." Diane corrected him. "Make it look locked. We don't need to stop him physically. We just need him to think he can't proceed." Caleb zoomed tighter. Every instruction, every face, every word. Then Brent made the first real mistake of the night. He turned toward the volunteers and spoke loudly enough for every phone nearby to capture it. "Remember, if Walker gets upset," he tapped his own chest, "don't touch him. Make him touch us." Several people laughed. Caleb didn't. His phone stayed perfectly still. One older volunteer quietly asked, "What if he just sits in his truck?" Brent frowned. "Then we keep talking. We delay him. The longer this goes, the worse he'll look." Diane nodded approvingly. "Exactly. We're building a record." The phrase hung in the air. Building a record. Not discovering facts. Not investigating anything. Manufacturing a story before the first conversation even happened. Caleb checked the time. 11:39 p.m. If traffic hadn't delayed me, I'd be here any minute. He quietly backed deeper into the tree line overlooking the entrance. From there, he could see every barricade, every volunteer, every camera, every license plate. He adjusted the zoom one final time. Then, in the distance, another pair of headlights rounded the last curve leading toward the ranch. My old pickup. Caleb pressed record. "This is it." He lowered his voice until it was almost a whisper. "They've built the stage. They just don't realize they're about to become the evidence." My headlights washed over the barricades again as Caleb slipped his phone into his jacket and walked calmly toward my truck. The volunteers straightened their jackets. Several lifted their phones. Brent planted himself directly in front of my bumper. "Mr. Walker," he announced loudly, making sure every camera caught his voice. "You are being instructed not to enter this property until our environmental review has concluded." I rested both hands on the steering wheel. "You're standing on my property." Brent smiled for the cameras. "We've already explained the situation." "No," I replied. "You've repeated it." He frowned. "I don't see the difference. The difference is evidence." I pointed toward the aluminum sign. "Who issued that inspection?" "The Cedar Ridge Shores HOA. I asked who issued it. "Our board." I asked what legal authority. For the first time, Brent hesitated. Behind him, Diane Mercer stepped forward, perfectly composed. "The Homeowners Association has a duty to protect shared environmental interests surrounding Lynch Lake." I looked at her. "You don't own my shoreline. It affects our residents. My fences affect your view. That doesn't make them yours either." Several volunteers exchanged uneasy glances. Diane ignored them. "Mr. Walker, your cooperation tonight would prevent unnecessary escalation." "I agree." She smiled. "Good. So move your vehicles." Her smile disappeared. Before she could answer, Caleb quietly spoke beside me. "Ethan." I looked over. "They've been waiting for you to lose your temper." I noticed. "So don't." I nodded once. Brent apparently took our conversation as weakness. He stepped closer to my driver's door. "Sir, if you continue refusing instructions..." "My instructions?" "No. Your instructions. My driveway, my deed, my taxes, my insurance, my liability." I leaned slightly out the window. "You still haven't explained why you're here." Diane answered instead. "We're documenting environmental concerns." "Wonderful. So document them. We are. Then why block the entrance? Neither of them answered. One of the younger volunteers quietly lowered his phone. Another shifted backward. The confidence that had filled the checkpoint an hour earlier was beginning to leak away. Brent suddenly changed tactics. "If you drive forward," he announced loudly, "you'll interfere with an active inspection." Caleb chuckled. "There isn't one." Brent turned sharply. "You've already interfered enough." "No." Caleb's voice stayed level. "I've observed. Same difference. Not in court." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Diane's eyes narrowed. "You seem very confident." "I've seen enough." "You haven't seen our documentation." Caleb looked directly at her. "I've seen how it was created." A flicker of concern crossed Diane's face before disappearing. She recovered almost instantly. "Mr. Walker, last opportunity. Back your truck out." I reached into the center console. Half the volunteers immediately tensed. Phones lifted higher. Brent took one cautious step backward. Instead of a weapon, I removed a folded county property map. I held it against the window. My recorded survey. Then another document. My deed. Finally, a laminated county parcel map. The legal boundary. I never left the driver's seat. Never raised my voice. Never moved toward anyone. Brent stared at the papers. Diane refused to look. "We're not discussing paperwork tonight." I almost laughed. "That's exactly what we're discussing." A distant engine echoed somewhere down the county road. Nobody seemed to notice except Caleb. His head turned slightly. He listened for several seconds. Then he smiled. "Right on time." Brent frowned. "What are you talking about?" The engine grew louder. Another. Then another. Blue and red lights suddenly reflected off the barricades before the sirens were even switched on. Two sheriff's cruisers rolled around the bend, followed by a county deputy's pickup. Every volunteer froze. Brent whispered, almost to himself. Diane said she already talked to them. Diane's confident posture faltered for the first time all night. Sheriff Tom Granger climbed out of the lead cruiser without rushing. He looked first at the barricades, then at the floodlights, then at the fake inspection sign, finally at the line of HOA volunteers standing across a private ranch entrance. He removed his hat, scratched the side of his head, and let out a long breath. "I've been doing this job 28 years. His eyes settled on Brent. "I've seen cattle block roads. I've seen elk block roads. I've even seen tourists block roads." He pointed at the barricade. "But this..." His gaze slowly swept across every volunteer. "This is a new one." The entire checkpoint fell silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Sheriff Granger wasn't listening anymore. He was observing. And that was exactly what Caleb had been waiting for. Sheriff Tom Granger didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask who called first. He didn't ask who believed they were right. Instead, he pointed toward opposite sides of the driveway. "Nobody talks over anybody." His voice stayed calm. "Mr. Walker, stay with your truck. Miss Mercer, over there. Everyone else, where you are." The chatter stopped immediately. Deputy Sarah Mills began walking the perimeter, taking slow photographs of the barricades, caution tape, floodlights, and the aluminum inspection sign. Another deputy examined the fiberglass stakes driven into the pasture. "Sheriff," he called, "these markers run well inside the fence." Granger nodded but said nothing. He turned to Diane first. "Who authorized this operation?" "The Cedar Ridge Shores Board." I asked who. "I did." "Do you have written authority from the county?" "No." "From the state?" "No." "From the property owner?" Diane glanced at me. No. Granger wrote 3 short lines in a notebook. Then he faced Brent. You? Brent swallowed. We're protecting the community. I didn't ask why. I asked what legal authority you relied on. Brent looked toward Diane. She didn't answer. Neither did he. The sheriff closed his notebook. Mr. Walker. I handed him my deed, the county parcel map, and the certified survey I'd carried in my truck. He examined each page carefully. You keep these with you? I've had HOA problems before. He gave a slight nod. Smart. After several quiet moments, he folded the documents and handed them back. So far, he said, everything you've shown me says this driveway, these fences, and the shoreline belong to you. They do. Before Diane could interrupt, Caleb stepped forward. Sheriff. Granger looked at him. My name's Caleb Brooks. I know who you are. I've got something you need to see. He unlocked his phone. I started recording shortly after 11 this morning. Diane's face lost its color. Brent's shoulders stiffened. Sheriff Granger accepted the phone. Continuous recording? With timestamps. No edits. The first video began playing. Brent's voice filled the quiet night. Move that marker another 10 feet. The deputy paused. Timestamp? 11:42 a.m., Caleb answered. The next clip showed volunteers unloading fiberglass stakes, then another. Brent saying, forget the fence, another. We're documenting everything first, another. If Walker gets angry, don't touch him. Make him touch us. Nobody spoke. The only sounds came from Caleb's recordings. One volunteer slowly lowered her head. Another covered his face with both hands. Sheriff Granger watched every clip without interruption. When he reached the recording of Diane inspecting the fake checkpoint, he replayed it. The more official this looks, the better. Replay. We're building a record. Replay. Make it look locked. The sheriff finally locked the phone. He looked directly at Diane. Is that your voice? She hesitated. It appears to be. Appears. I'd like to speak with an attorney. Granger nodded once. That's your right. He handed the phone back to Caleb. Don't delete anything. I won't. Deputy Mills approached carrying one of the fiberglass stakes. We've located the actual county survey monument. She pointed 6 feet away. The temporary marker was intentionally placed beyond it. Granger looked at Brent. Who installed these? Nobody answered. Linda Foster quietly stepped out from behind the volunteers. I know. Every head turned. She looked exhausted. I was at the board meeting. Diane whispered sharply. Linda. Linda ignored her. I told them this wasn't legal. Her voice shook, but she kept going. They planned the checkpoint. They printed fake inspection notices. They practiced what to say before Ethan got home. Silence spread through the crowd. One volunteer stared at Diane. You told us the county approved this, another added. You said we had emergency authority. I never would have come if I'd known. More voices followed. I thought this was official. I thought the sheriff knew. I thought we had permission. The checkpoint that had looked so organized an hour earlier began falling apart in minutes. Not because anyone shouted. Because everyone started telling the truth. Sheriff Granger raised one hand. That's enough. He turned to his deputies. Photograph every barricade. Collect every temporary marker. Bag every inspection notice. He looked toward the folding table stacked with clipboards. Nothing leaves this property until we're finished. Diane took one uncertain step backward. So, we're free to go? Granger's expression didn't change. No. He looked across the entire scene. This stopped being an HOA dispute the moment evidence was fabricated. He paused. Now it's an investigation. For the first time that night, nobody argued with him. Deputies worked quietly under the floodlights, photographing every barricade before loading it into evidence trucks. The fake inspection notices disappeared into sealed evidence bags. Fiberglass stakes were marked, tagged, and compared against the county survey monument still embedded in the ground only a few feet away. Sheriff Tom Granger turned toward Diane Mercer. "Your board meeting minutes." She blinked. "What?" "I'll need every document related to tonight's operation. We're under no obligation to hand over internal HOA records." Before the sheriff could answer, I spoke. "Maybe not tonight." I looked directly at Diane. "But you won't be keeping them for long." She folded her arms. "You think this is over?" "No. It's just becoming official." By sunrise, my attorney, Rebecca Sloan, was already reviewing everything Caleb had recorded. She watched the videos once without speaking. Then she watched them again. Finally, she paused on Diane's handwritten planning sheet that Linda had photographed before leaving the board meeting. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "This changes everything." I looked across her conference table. "It's one sentence. It's an admission." She slid the image toward me. Written beneath the meeting agenda, in Diane's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Create documentation first. Legal justification can follow after community review." Rebecca tapped the page. "This destroys any claim that the inspection was conducted in good faith." She opened another folder containing copies of my deed, county surveys, tax records, and shoreline maps. They weren't responding to a legal problem. They were trying to create one. Within hours, she filed an emergency motion in district court requesting an immediate injunction preventing Cedar Ridge Shores HOA, its officers, agents, and volunteers from entering my property or representing themselves as having authority over my land. The judge scheduled an expedited hearing. Things were moving faster than Diane ever expected. Meanwhile, investigators executed a consent search at the HOA office after several board members voluntarily surrendered association records. Gary Nolan was among the first to cooperate. "I kept copies of everything," he told investigators. "I thought we were approving landscaping." Instead, investigators found meeting agendas, volunteer sign-up sheets, printed inspection packets, reimbursement requests for barricades, portable floodlights, and reflective safety jackets. Every purchase had been paid from HOA funds. Deputy Mills flipped through the expense ledger. Portable traffic control equipment. She looked up. Purchased 3 days before the inspection. Another investigator opened a storage cabinet. Inside sat unopened packages labeled boundary stakes, 100 count. Invoice matched the same batch recovered from my pasture. Nothing about the operation had been spontaneous. Every detail had been planned. Linda Foster arrived later that afternoon carrying a small envelope. I almost threw this away. Rebecca opened it carefully. Inside was Diane's original meeting packet. Most pages were identical to the copies already collected. One wasn't. Folded between 2 agendas was a draft memo with handwritten revisions. Rebecca read silently before sliding it across the table. At the bottom, another handwritten instruction appeared. If county approval cannot be obtained before inspection, proceed under HOA authority and address legal issues afterward. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. That's not negligence, that's intent. Linda lowered her eyes. I should have stopped it. You tried, I said. They didn't listen. They listened to Diane. Linda nodded slowly. I'll testify. No conditions. No favors. I'll tell the court exactly what happened. Rebecca extended her hand. That may be the most important decision anyone on that board has made. 2 days later, county surveyors completed an independent review of my property. Their report was direct. Every disputed stake installed by the HOA had been placed inside my deeded land. None matched recorded property lines. None reflected any existing easement. None corresponded with county records. Sheriff Granger read the report twice before placing it into the growing case file. Then he looked toward Rebecca. They didn't just cross a fence. They ignored every legal boundary that already existed. Rebecca closed her folder. And now we can prove they knew it. Outside the courthouse, Diane watched investigators carrying sealed boxes out of the HOA office. She no longer looked confident. She looked worried. Because for the first time since this began, the evidence wasn't coming from Ethan. It was coming from her own association. The district courtroom was nearly full by the time Judge Harold Bennett entered. Homeowners from Cedar Ridge Shores filled the gallery, whispering among themselves. Some had volunteered the night my driveway was blocked. Others had come simply to understand how a disagreement over a lakeshore had become a case involving fabricated evidence, trespass, and misuse of HOA authority. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Bennett looked over the case file stacked neatly before him. "I've reviewed the preliminary submissions," he said. "Today I want facts, not speeches." Rebecca Sloan stood first. "Your Honor, this case is not about a disagreement between neighbors." She held up a photograph of my ranch entrance. "It is about an organized effort to create authority where none existed." She placed the photograph on the evidence screen. The fake barricades appeared, then the inspection sign, then the temporary boundary stakes. One image after another, each connected to a timestamp, a witness, or a recovered document. Rebecca turned toward the judge. The defendants claimed they were responding to an emergency. She pressed a button. Caleb's first video began playing. Brent's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Move that marker another 10 feet. Another clip followed. "Forget the fence, then another. The more official this looks, the better." No one in the courtroom moved. Rebecca stopped the video. Nothing about this was spontaneous. She lifted Diane's handwritten planning document. The board was instructed to create documentation before finding legal justification. Judge Bennett examined the original page carefully. He adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Mercer, is this your handwriting?" Diane rose slowly. "It appears to be." "Appears?" She hesitated. "Yes, it is. And did you write these instructions before entering Mr. Walker's property?" "Yes." Her attorney quickly stood. "Your Honor, the language has been taken out of context." Judge Bennett nodded. "Then provide the context." The attorney paused. There was concern about shoreline management. Rebecca immediately approached the witness stand. "Did anyone from the county request this inspection?" "No." "Did any state agency authorize it?" "No." "Did Mr. Walker invite the HOA onto his property?" "No." "So your board created an inspection." She paused, printed inspection notices, installed temporary boundary markers, blocked a private driveway, and represented yourselves as conducting official business. She let the silence settle, without legal authority. Diane lowered her eyes. "Yes." A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Judge Bennett tapped his gavel once. "Order." Rebecca called her next witness, Linda Foster. Linda testified calmly. She described the board meeting, the pressure to remain silent, the discussion about provoking a confrontation. Then she identified the handwritten planning documents. "I warned them this wasn't legal." Rebecca asked one final question. "Why are you testifying today?" Linda looked toward Diane before answering. because being loyal to neighbors is not the same as helping them break the law. The courtroom remained silent. Next came County Surveyor Daniel Reeves. He displayed certified maps comparing the original deed with the HOA's temporary markers. Every red marker placed by the HOA sat inside my recorded property. The legal boundary was already clearly established, Reeves testified. There was no uncertainty requiring private action. Rebecca smiled slightly. No further questions. Diane's attorney attempted one final argument. The association acted in good faith to protect community interests. Judge Bennett leaned forward. I've heard considerable evidence. He looked directly at the attorney. I'm still waiting to hear legal authority. The attorney opened his mouth, then quietly sat down. Judge Bennett closed the final evidence binder. He looked across the courtroom at Diane. Good intentions, even if genuine, do not permit citizens to assume governmental powers. He turned toward me. Nor do they permit an association to interfere with lawful possession of private property. The courtroom became so quiet that the turning of a single page sounded loud. Judge Bennett placed both hands on the bench. I am prepared to rule. No one shifted in their seat. Even Diane Mercer stopped looking at her attorney and faced the bench. Judge Harold Bennett spoke slowly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The evidence establishes that Mr. Ethan Walker is the lawful owner of the property in dispute, including the driveway, shoreline, and adjoining acreage identified in the county survey. He glanced at the certified maps before continuing. The defendants entered that property without permission. They erected temporary boundary markers inconsistent with recorded surveys. They obstructed lawful access. They represented themselves as exercising authority they did not possess. Each sentence landed harder than the last. Judge Bennett looked directly at Diane. Private homeowners associations are created by contract. They are not governmental bodies. They cannot invent regulatory powers simply because they believe their objectives are worthwhile. The courtroom remained silent. The court therefore grants Mr. Walker's request for a permanent injunction. Rebecca Sloan made one brief note. I simply listened. Effective immediately, Cedar Ridge Shores HOA, its officers, directors, employees, contractors, volunteers, and agents are permanently prohibited from entering Mr. Walker's property without his express permission or a lawful court order. Diane lowered her head. Judge Bennett wasn't finished. The evidence further demonstrates a coordinated effort to fabricate documentation before establishing legal justification. He held up Diane's handwritten planning note. This document alone raises serious concerns. He turned toward the county prosecutor seated in the gallery. The court orders that today's record, together with all admitted evidence, be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for review of potential criminal violations, including criminal trespass, conspiracy, evidence fabrication, and any other offenses supported by the investigation. A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. The bailiff immediately called for silence. Judge Bennett continued. The court also recommends review of the association's financial records based upon testimony that community funds were used to purchase materials employed during the unlawful operation. Gary Nolan slowly closed his eyes. He already knew what investigators were going to find. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered near the front steps. Questions came from every direction. Mr. Walker, do you consider this a victory? I shook my head. I consider it a reminder. Property rights don't disappear because enough people vote against them. Another reporter turned toward Rebecca. What happens next? The injunction takes effect immediately. The criminal investigation continues independently, and the financial review will determine whether HOA funds were improperly used. Before another question could be asked, Sheriff Tom Granger walked down the courthouse steps carrying a thick evidence box. He stopped beside me. You were patient. I had good advice. I looked toward Caleb. He smiled. You had good evidence. Granger nodded. That's what mattered. The investigation accelerated over the following weeks. State financial auditors examined years of HOA bank records. Receipts uncovered purchases that had never appeared in annual reports. Portable barricades, safety jackets, traffic control equipment, printing costs for inspection packets. Several expenses had been disguised as community improvement materials. Investigators also discovered reimbursement requests approved without board authorization. Gary cooperated fully. So did several former volunteers. Each interview painted the same picture. Diane had convinced people they were protecting the neighborhood. Instead, they had financed an illegal operation with membership dues. One by one, homeowners publicly withdrew their support. Emergency meetings turned into angry confrontations. Board members resigned. Committees dissolved. Insurance carriers questioned continued coverage. Legal bills multiplied by the week. Within 2 months, Cedar Ridge Shores HOA suspended nearly all operations while members voted to remove the remaining leadership. The organization that had once claimed authority over my ranch could barely govern itself. One afternoon, I drove past the clubhouse on my way into town. The parking lot was nearly empty. The large entrance sign still stood beside the road. But someone had removed the polished brass plaque listing Diane Mercer as HOA president. Only 4 empty screw holes remained. Caleb looked out the passenger window. Funny. What? They spent months trying to move your property line. He glanced back toward the abandoned clubhouse. They ended up erasing their own. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The legal battle was over. But something more important had happened. The truth had outlasted the performance, and the people who tried to manufacture a story had become part of the evidence that ended it. 3 months later, the gravel road leading to my ranch looked exactly the way it always should have. No barricades, no floodlights, no caution tape, just a cedar gate swinging quietly on well-oiled hinges. The temporary survey stakes had long since been removed by investigators. The only marker left standing was the original county survey monument that had rested in the same place for decades, exactly where my grandfather had first shown it to my father. Some things didn't need to be reinvented. They simply needed to be respected. The Cedar Ridge Shores HOA no longer existed. After the court's injunction, the financial investigation expanded into a full audit. Membership meetings became resignation meetings. Insurance coverage was withdrawn. Special assessments to cover legal fees were overwhelmingly rejected by homeowners who had grown tired of defending actions they never fully understood. The association voted to dissolve. Its remaining assets were transferred according to state law, and the clubhouse was eventually sold to a local conservation nonprofit that planned to use it for public education programs about the lake. Ironically, the first organization to genuinely protect the shoreline had nothing to do with an HOA. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Caleb pulled into my driveway carrying a paper bag from the diner in town. I figured you hadn't eaten lunch. I was hoping you'd say that. We carried sandwiches onto the porch overlooking Lynch Lake. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was familiar. The kind of silence I'd been trying to get home to the night all of this started. Caleb finally nodded toward the entrance gate. Looks better without a roadblock. It was always supposed to. He laughed. I still can't believe they rehearsed an argument. They believed appearances were stronger than facts. And they forgot cameras record both. We sat there watching a pair of fishermen idle across the lake toward the public boat launch. The same launch that had always been available to everyone willing to use it. Nobody complained. Nobody demanded access through someone else's land. The law had never prevented neighbors from enjoying the lake. It had only required them to respect property they didn't own. Later that afternoon, another pickup rolled into the driveway. Linda Foster stepped out carrying a small cardboard box. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. She walked onto the porch and carefully set the box on the table. I found these while cleaning out the old HOA office. Inside were copies of the original meeting agendas, newsletters, and one final binder labeled Community Safety Committee. I thought your attorney should have them. I'll make sure she does. Linda hesitated before speaking again. I also wanted to apologize. You already testified. I know, but that's different. She looked toward the shoreline. I should have spoken louder before everything happened. I shook my head. You warned them. They chose not to listen. She smiled faintly. I won't make that mistake again. After she drove away, Caleb looked at me. You forgive people pretty easily. Only the ones who decide to tell the truth before it's too late. As evening settled over the ranch, I walked down to the water's edge. The reflections on the lake were calm again. No flashing emergency lights. No fake inspection signs. No strangers pretending authority they never possessed. Just open water stretching toward the opposite shore. I thought about everything the past few months had taught me. Owning land isn't just about fences, deeds, or survey pins. It's about protecting something entrusted to you and understanding that real authority comes from the law, not from confidence, loud voices, or carefully staged performances. The court had restored my rights. Caleb's recordings had preserved the truth. Rebecca's work had transformed facts into justice. Sheriff Granger's patience had allowed evidence, not assumptions, to decide the outcome. Each of them had played a different role. None of them had needed anger to win. I closed the gate as the last light faded over Lynch Lake, not to keep good neighbors out, but as a quiet reminder that every property line means something, and that lasting peace begins where respect for another person's land begins.
If this experience taught me anything, it's that staying calm when you're being challenged isn't weakness. It can be your greatest strength. I didn't protect my ranch by shouting louder or forcing my way through a barricade. I protected it by knowing my right, keeping good record, trusting people of integrity, and letting the truth speak through real evidence. In the end, that approach restored peace instead of reacting more conflict. And that's something worth holding on to long after the courtroom is empty. To me, that's what this country has always been about. We look out for our neighbors, but we also respect boundaries. We look out for our neighbors, but we also respect boundaries, honor honest work, and remember that fairness matters most when emotions are running high. Quiet determination may not make headlines, but it often leaves the strongest legacy. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand your ground the right way, even when it would be easier to give it? If you have, type yes in the comments, or if you ever deal with an HOA or a property dispute, share your story below. I read your comments, and they are often the inspiration of future stories like this. And if you enjoy a story about everyday people standing firm with dignity, patience, and the law on their side, I'd be honored to have you subscribe. There are plenty more HOA, ranch, and land ownership story waiting for you, and I'd love to have you along for the journey.